Salvete, and welcome to Latin via Lectionary, a short Latin lesson drawn from the Sunday Mass readings. I'm Sean Burns of Latin via Liturgy, and I'm happy to share this week's lesson with you. Today, the 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time, from St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, the feeding of the 5,000. One construction shows up 3 times within this passage, the ablative absolute. Let's take a look at one of them together. Acceptis quinque panibus et duobus piscibus, aspiciens in caelum benedixit, et fregit, et dedit discipulis panes. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he said the blessing, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples. Take a look at that top line, now highlighted in red, acceptis, a participle, perfect passive participle in the ablative case, modifying both panibus and piscibus. Literally, with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish having been taken. Now, in our English translation, we smooth that out a little bit and say, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. But I think it's worthwhile to point out that aspiciens in the second line is a present participle, and it's totally different than the acceptis in the top line. So a more literal translation would show that difference, with the loaves and the fish having been taken, looking up into heaven. And that's the key to the ablative absolute, is the idea that we have this little phrase that doesn't quite fit with the rest of the sentence. So let's take a look at the description and the rules and other examples of the ablative absolute. The ablative absolute, ablativus absolutus, is a phrase cut loose from the rest of the sentence. That's what absolutus means. Absolute means removed from, cut loose from the rest of the sentence. So it's a phrase that informs the sentence but does not connect grammatically to any of the other words in the sentence. And that's the reason it sits there in the ablative case at the beginning. So our example here, acceptis panibus, with the loaves having been taken, really sets the stage for the rest of the actions of the sentence. We see the ablative absolute in 3 ways in Latin, typically. First of all, the most common by far is a participle and a noun, like our acceptis panibus here. We can also see a noun and an adjective, here an example from Genesis, in shio te, with you being unaware. And then finally, we see sometimes a noun along with another noun, teste David cum Sibylla, teste David, the ablative absolute there, with David being the witness, with David as the witness. And what we see in those second 2 examples is there is no participle, because Latin does not have the participle of the verb to be, but we supply that meaning, being, connecting, in English at least, connecting the noun and the adjective or the 2 nouns together. And that's typically our 3 types of ablatives absolute: noun and participle, noun and noun, noun and adjective. And we see them, again, to show some information that wants to be added to the sentence but is not connected to the rest of the sentence. Your typical English translation for a student learning the ablative absolute would be, with the blank having been blanked, right? With the loaves having been taken. The job of a translator is to smooth that out into idiomatic English, and that's why we end up with things like taking the loaves, or after he had taken the loaves. We can turn it into a clause in English. In Latin, however, it's not truly a clause. We see 2 other examples of the ablative absolute in today's passage from the Gospel. Earlier was the phrase, Vespere autem facto, accesserunt ad eum discipuli. When it was evening ends up being the translation literally, with evening, however, having been made. When it was evening, much better in English. And then at the very end, exceptis mulieribus et parvulis, not counting women and children, or more literally, with the women and children having been accepted. So there are your 3 ablatives absolute from today's passage. Keep in mind the idea of the ablative absolute, very often a participle along with a noun, other words perhaps around it to give more information, but just a small little construction attached to the sentence to give more information that is not in any way grammatically connected to the words in the sentence itself. Thank you for joining me for this week's short Latin lesson. Please come back next week for another lesson from the Sunday Mass readings. Valete et bonam Dominicam.